for this round of discussion. And as I call out your names, I would request you to please come on stage and take a seat. Our first panelist for today is Dr. Sanjay Chaturvedi, Chief Executive Officer, Aurobindo Pharma Limited. Can we have a round of applause? We also have Mr. Rakesh Sablok, Director, Biogene Labs India Private Limited and Sentier Consulting and Healthcare. The applause shouldn't stop. Can we do that? Yes, thank you. Next, we have Mr. Rahul Datta, Chief Operating Officer, Fernandez Hospitals, Unit of Fernandez Foundation. We also have with us Dr. Srikanth Vodnala, Chief Operating Officer, TX Hospitals. A very, very warm welcome to all of you panelists, and to moderate this round of discussion, I would like to call upon Dr. Karan Thakur, Group Lead, Sustainability and ESG and Vice President of Public Affairs for Indraprastha Apollo Hospitals.
Thank you. Thank you, Dun & Bradstreet, for organizing this very timely conversation around ESG and its role in pharmaceuticals and the healthcare sector. ESG, as some of you may know, or if some of you may have heard of the term, is really something that has come into vogue in the past 4 or 5 years. And we in India are not immune to it. We in the healthcare pharma sector are doubly not immune to it, because all of the pillars that constitute E and S and G, which is the environment, social and governance parameters, very much cover our sectors. And it's not as if we have not been looking at ESG now or from the past. We've actually been very mindful of it, whether it is through our manufacturing practices, whether through our service standards, whether it's through our ethical and transparent approach towards how we treat our patients and customers. ESG has really been at the heart of what we do as a socially sort of forward-looking organizations that we have in the health and pharma sector. So now that it has been codified under ESG, I think it's very important that we start having a discussion around it, because with codification comes regulations, expectations, and these expectations are now not just of the customer, but the wider stakeholder community, whether it's your investor, the shareholders, the media, governments, regulators, patients. And I don't mean that in any order of importance, but those are some of the stakeholder universe components that are looking at ESG very carefully. So whether you're a listed entity, whether you're wanting to get listed, whether you're a startup, whether you're a venture capital fund, whether you're an established player, whether you want to offload an established player at the top, whatever your perch may be within health and pharma, the fact is that ESG and sustainability is going to become top of mind for leaders and leadership. And I'm very glad and I'm incredibly happy to have such leaders on this dais here today to discuss the subject of ESG. I'll just spend 15 seconds on what ESG stands for. As you know, these are codified standards on environment, social and governance aspects of every company. Right now, there are mandates to report this if you're a listed entity, but as time progresses, more and more regulators will at least expect you to put out forward-looking statements in your annual report, or statements that you file with the MCA or the stock exchanges on what are you doing for these 3 specific pillars. Previously, under the BRR regulation of SEBI, a lot of companies had to report BRR, which has now been modified into the BRSR, which is the business responsibility and sustainability reporting. So enough of the gyan. I now want to listen to from the experts on what they have to say on ESG and sustainability. And first and foremost, I'd like to start with Dr. Chaturvedi. Dr. Chaturvedi, you have vast experience in the field of pharmaceuticals. You've seen this industry both from the consumer side, you've also seen it from the manufacturing side, you've seen it globally and within India. How do you think ESG is situated in healthcare and pharma in general?
Hello. Okay, got it. Thanks a lot, Karan. So, when I look at the pharma healthcare industry, it is no different than any other industry. The whole concept of ESG really started maybe over a decade ago in the Western world. And there was a recent study that was put out by a Boston University that talks about the investment parameters of the young generation, the Gen Z versus the baby boomers. And the clear distinction is that in the investment portfolio, baby boomers, who are people, typically my age group, don't have more than 25% of the companies with, ESG kind of publications. Whereas the younger generation, which would be my kids' generation, that is one of the first things they look at rather than, am I going to make money? So it's not about picking one or the other. It is actually about picking both. It's not either or, it is and. And therefore, I think the younger generation today is much more clued in towards being more responsible citizens than what my generation has been and maybe what my parents and grandparents' generation has been. So ESG is not just a nice thing to do. It is imperative. In fact, it is a business imperative. And let me elaborate a little bit on that. On the environmental side, a lot of the metrics that are used dovetail and very nicely with the sustainability development goals of the United Nations. So there are clear mandates of water reduction. There are clear mandates on effluents. There are very clear mandates that at least 60% of all the hazardous waste must be recycled within your facility. 80-85% of the non-hazardous waste must be recycled and so forth. And I'm very happy to say that at least the large pharma players have done a fabulous job because they understand that to contribute towards sustainability, not from the environmental side, certainly from the environment side, but the business sustainability side, you can't ignore this anymore. On the S side, which is the social side, companies make an effort to take care of the entire social ecosystem, which is not just where they are located, their employees, all the partners that work with them, their vendors, who are the neighbors, who are the customers, who are the delivery logistics people and so forth. And of course, on the governance side, we've all seen cases where, lack of governance can really take a very nasty turn for the south very rapidly. So having proper governance in place, along with taking care of social and society, at the same time not compromising on environment, is not just a good thing to do, it is the right thing to do, and it's a business imperative.
So it's a business imperative. This is not just good to do. This is not CSR. A lot of people confuse this with CSR. Would you like to throw some light on that?
Yeah. So thank you for pointing that out, Karan. See, CSR is corporate social responsibility, where there is a government mandate that X percentage of your profits will be spent on CSR activities. So for a company like Aurobindo, on an average, I think last 4 or 5 years, we've spent close to 230 crores. Just last Sunday, about 9 days ago, we've unveiled a new oncology block at a cancer hospital at the cost of 80 crores. So this is all, part of what the corporation does from a social responsibility. This has got no bearing on, will this have any impact on the business? Certainly it has an impact on your brand. You can't delink those. But I also want to make a distinction. It's got nothing to do with PSR, which is personal social responsibility, that a lot of us in our personal capacities do. But ESG is very, very different from CSR activities.
Thank you for pointing that out. Responsibility, charity, and how we operate, they are used very loosely and interchangeably, but they're actually quite distinct. And Dr. Chaturvedi has very nicely outlined that. I'd like to now turn to Rahul. We've spoken about CSR. We've spoken about what our responsibility towards the environment, towards society, towards governance, ethical practices is. A lot of people in healthcare argue that actually we are ESG compliant just by the nature of business that we are in, and so could the pharma industry also argue on that. So how do you look at ESG, and especially now when you would be hearing murmurs of you having to report on this, what is your outlook on it, and where do you think it is evolving for the healthcare sector?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to thank DNB for giving us this opportunity. I think this is one of the most pertinent topic that they have picked up, and we are thankful that we are a part of it. Thank you, Karan. I think what is very important to understand is that in our healthcare sector, and I think to some extent I would agree with them, Karan, that it is one of our responsibilities, which as it is by virtue of our business, by virtue of our service, we are doing it. But it is more inherent in the way we run our organization is also very, very pertinent. So if you look at ESG from environmental perspective, even though like Mr. Chaturvedi said, Karan said that it is existing for last 10 years, this kind of term has coined, but we have been doing ESG for a long time in bits and pieces, in piecemeals. So environmental, we have a lot of licenses for a long time, whether it is related to water, whether it is reduction of water, usage of water, air pollution, wastage, biomedical waste, all of that always has been existing. Now, what is more important is, I think, which is probably what we need to look at as an outlook, Karan, is how do we integrate all of these ESG practices as a part of our operations, as a part of our practice, as a part of our culture. When we look at social aspect, how do we look at overall from a holistic point of view that health equity is not just a term, but when we look at actually all our stakeholders, like you mentioned, whether it is a patient, employees, our vendors, our let's say shareholders, we all become a part of it, and we look at in true sense what is investment. Investment is only money. Investment is also what we do in our planet. Investment is also what we do in our people. So all three P's is of most important, if you ask me. So together, if we look at a plan, which I think ESG is trying to give us, only thing what we probably look at is that how it is going to be applicable to a small scale hospital, to a large scale one, and probably those guidelines, if we can come up with, or probably if it is regulated and it is defined well, like we have in our healthcare sector for NABH for small scale to large scale, that itself probably will be giving us a lot of guideline, and then probably the road will be much more clearer.
Right. Mr. Sablok, I'd like to come to you. So we've heard about what it is, what ESG is, how do we approach it, what it isn't, and also a perspective on, parts of your businesses are sort of ESG compliant to begin with, or at least are tuned towards the aspects of ESG which investors and the larger stakeholder community is looking at. Now, this begs the question, how does one start approaching ESG? Now, do I open a Word document and start writing my report? Do I start data collection? Do I look at it as something that I need to first speak to my internal stakeholders? What do you think should be the approach if a manager is now tasked with looking at the ESG program?
Thanks, Karan, for giving an opportunity and asking a relevant question.
Just switch that on.
See, ESG is still a vague term as far as the stakeholders are concerned. What we have understood that it is important to be part of the global supply chain, as India is one of the pharmacy of the world. But when it comes to implementable action, still it is a gray area. Okay, SEBI regulates that you report a BFR reporting, BSR reporting. But still when it comes to stakeholder, the leaders of pharma industry, at their level it is a gray area. It varies from organization to organization. A leader sometimes who is very, very social and who is very, very conscious about the environment, he takes a decision that my organization should follow all the norms and get it implemented. On another hand, there is a company which still do not follow any of the norms. So it is very important to have a basic guidelines of ESG in place. Unless we don't have that, whether a large company or a small company or a mid-sized company, very difficult to measure it. ESG will just become a theoretical thing unless we don't have an implementable action plans to that. So what, as an industry leader, as a regulator, what we need to do is that form a committee of either the regulator as well as the industry leader, form a basic guidelines for the industry for ESG in pharma, and then start monitoring it. Today we don't have a baseline also in ESG as far as the majority of the pharma industry is concerned. It is every company, because India is a country of extremes. On one hand you have Aurobindo, which sells 95 to 98% to the regulated market. And on one hand, you have mankind, which has 95 to 97% sells to the Indian market. And both the guidelines and the plant standards which they follow is hell and heaven, because one has to supply to the developed market and one is catering only to the domestic market. So what the regulators and the industry leader need to sit that, whether it is for Indian market or a regulated market or a semi-regulated market, these are the basic guidelines which everyone need to follow. Anyone doing over and above is welcome, but this is the basic standards. So I think the industry still need to come on a consensus as well as the regulators, because if you talk of pharma industry, there are different regulators. There are FDA for companies supplying to US, MHRS, Anvisa for Brazil supply. Then you have the DCGI for the domestic supply. And on top of that, you also have a local FDA, which the understanding at all multiple levels are different on ESG. So I feel that we really need a framework to work towards that. So it will take some time before the industry start implementing it. But the basic requirement today is to form the minimal guidelines for the industry.
Right. So a floor and a ceiling, at least, so that you know where you stand and where you want to aspire to. That's a very important point. Dr. Srikanth, I'd like to come to you. As the head of a hospital, if you were to sit down with your HODs and you were to say that, look, we need to now formulate strategies around sustainability, around ESG. We may not start reporting on this today, but tomorrow when there's an expectation from either a regulator or an investor, or even from patients, or even for brand building, how do you think you would approach it, or how are you approaching this subject?
Thank you, Karan, for asking this question. Good afternoon to all. My sincere thanks to DNB for organizing this event and being with this wonderful afternoon to you all to have an understanding on ESG. First of all, if you look at the Indian healthcare delivery system, the predominant players are small scale and medium scale setups. So if you look at 60 to 70% of the Indian private healthcare system is consists of nursing homes, and the polyclinics are the 50 bedded hospital are maxed up to the 100 bed hospital. We as a hospital, when we sit and talk to our HODs, what we need to understand whether the ESG concepts are practicable. Practically, how practical it is important when we are implementing it. So a lot of the chunk is at the majority stake is at the smaller in scale, but when we are focusing smaller in scale, a lot of challenges they face. So if you take about large scale setups, we can name it in India. So hardly there are about 300 plus large scale hospitals, but if you look at the other end of, there is about 38,000, 39,000 setups wherein they would not even have the minimal criteria which is need to be required for the regular state level or central level regulations. So if we talk about state level clinical establishments act or allopathy registration act, they have set up the lot many guidelines, but the challenge is how many of them are actually practically implementing. And if you look at the central level guidelines, so there are challenges in every level. There's a long way to go, but when we discuss internally as a hospital, when I need to talk to my people, first and foremost, as Mr. Rakesh sir said, we need to have a baseline. Even for the hospital, so far there is no baseline for ESG principles. So we would like to have the baseline principles, standards, and there is required to have a regulatory body who would continuously monitor to put the minimal standards in the hospital. Maybe that can make it as a part of our regular standards, like we have so many, as Mr. Rahul said. So we have regulations for air, we have regulation for water coming out, the effluent, and as Dr. Chaturvedi said, so there is a standard principle that which we need, the effluent which is coming, that standard amount of thing which need to be purified, or the treatment to be done, and then it should be discarded to the regular sewage system in the outside. So likewise, when the government or the regulatory body wants to put up these kind of principle, be it in the environmental or social or governing related aspects, we feel that it should make the hospital industry representatives. So we have state level representatives at every stage. So they're the key people who stands on behalf of us. And sorry. So wherein these inputs would ideally required in order to put the large scale at the top line or the bare minimal standards, then when it comes to us, so again, as it is mentioned, so when even go for these regular regulatory things, so there is a standardization for the clinic is different and the small scale hospital is different and the large scale hospital is different. So we also believe and feel that we should also have certain guidelines with respect to the level of hospitals, and further it will brought down, and it is easier for us to talk to the our employees within the hospital. Otherwise what we're talking, they'll not be able to make the difference between
it may be E for a healthcare provider, it may be S, and for everybody is probably G. So is it only about being compliant to the laws, as Rahul says? That's that one important framework that we have to operate under. And if not, then how do we take it to the next step in identifying what is material to my company and my industry?
Okay, it's a very, very insightful question, and I could spend the whole afternoon talking about it. I think it is sufficient to say that from a compliance standpoint, from a legal compliance standpoint, what you have to do is have the report. There is no legal compliance that says, for example, on the social front, if I look at the UN sustainability goals, it says 12.5% of employees should be women. In India, there is no legal rule that says 2.5% or 10.5%. There's no such criteria. So just as an FYI, Aurobindo is at about 10% on that parameter. So there are what companies do is essentially look at the sustainability development goals, where the metrics are very, very well defined, and they try to extrapolate that to what makes most sense for them based on where they are. See, for example, if I'm running a manufacturing operation and I say I will target a workforce like the in terms of gender diversity, like the banking industry, it's not going to happen. On the other hand, when I do manufacturing, I will have certain hazardous material. If the UN goal says at least 60% must be handled internally, today Aurobindo is handling 85% internally. Because when we did the benchmarking, we were already close to 60%. So you try to be, I think the best way to think about it is ESG goals and metrics is what helps you achieve the best version of yourself.
I think that's the best way to put this, that you achieve the best form of yourself, and congratulations on what Aurobindo is doing. It's not just about basic bare minimum standards, but trying to then aspire even higher and then set industry benchmarks. If
Absolutely.
there aren't enough benchmarks available, then you might as well set those benchmarks. I think that's one approach, and congratulations to your organization to do that. Mr. Sablok, I'll just like to bring you into this. A lot of this, and Dr. Chaturvedi spoke about the UN SDGs. These are 17 goals that the United Nations has set out. By 2030, every nation has to attain them or make meaningful progress. And we're already halfway through that cycle. And unfortunately, we have not made enough progress across countries and regions. But anyway, so each organization has to play its part. I'd like to bring in the environment aspect. Now, for a lot of organizations, it may not be material. For example, I come from the provider network, and for us, social and governance takes precedence in the ESG framework. But then we know climate action, net zero targets, India has committed to 2070 as its year of becoming net zero as an economy. Yeah. So more and more questions around being carbon neutral, reducing your carbon footprint are going to become important. How important is the E within this ESG framework for pharma and for the sector as a whole?
E is very important for the pharma because we are one of the largest industry in terms of our waste, and we need to be, because our waste are extremely hazardous. If you talk of, we manufacture antibiotics, penicillin, which can go into the water and can spoil the entire environment across it. So E is very important, and in what we have seen, that most of the pharma or the healthcare providers, they have tied up with external vendors who do the biomedical waste degradation, even disposal and all. But it is the responsibility, social responsibility of the industry to ensure that whatever they are disposing, their waste vendors also takes utmost care in ensuring that they are discarded in a right manner, they are well treated, because even a 5 kg worth of effluent, if not treated well, can spoil the entire locality. So it's a social responsibility. So far, what has happened, that majority of that industry put it as a responsibility of their EHS department, who just deal with the external vendors. But they really need to ensure that the entire, it is protecting the society, protecting the environment, and utmost care is taken by the vendors who they deal with. Because vendors, they don't have direct control. So that needs to be ensured.
Right. So after you've signed up a vendor who takes care of this, you are actually outsourcing some of the control, but then it's incumbent on the organization to also see what is happening to your waste, because ultimately it'll come back to you. So that's an important point. And I'd also like to bring in Dr. Srikanth on the waste aspect of it, since we are now actually doing ESG in action to see what we can do. We've seen during COVID, the 3 years of COVID, there's been an exponential increase in single-use plastics, things like gloves, masks, etc., biomedical waste as a whole, and hospitals have generated, actually it's not even quantified what the increase has been, but we know it would be upward of at least 7 to 10 times of what it was previously. What strategies can we put into place which are easy to do, or which you are thinking about, since waste and environment are closely interlinked and hospitals are going to be measured, maybe not so much on the emissions, although that's pretty big, but also things like waste and what we do with our water. What is your approach towards this?
See, the environmental. So as you rightly said, the waste which is being generated in the hospital is exponentially increased. And the already regulatory system, which is placed in every state has got its own regulatory system to control the environmental spoilers, or the effluent, or it could be a effluent fluid, or it could be a hazardous material, or it could be any other material which is going out harmful to the society. So it is already laid down certain regulations which need to be treated partially at home, and then you send it outside, so that it is, because most of the environmental related things are outsourced, to be honest. So unless in the large scale setups wherein they have their own unit for entire incineration and the disposal of it, and doing the STP and releasing it to the regular drainage, unless, so most of the stuff which is being outsourced to the third party. But what we feel is, when we actually sign up with any third party agency, or before we get into the agreement, as sir rightly said, so there's a criteria. Even if you look at the other independent bodies for quality accreditations like NABH and JCI, they also talks about it, and very specifically they also mention the place wherein we have an MOU with them, and there is a site inspection report which will have to go there and see how they're actually doing the entire process. So are they adhering the standard material and doing the proper sterilization, or before it gets discarded. So there's a lot of regulations, because when we are giving it to the third party, it is our responsibility to ensure that they are in comply with the standards. So the vendor evaluation and the checklist what we do at the site verification, and the equipment what they follow, and the post procedural thing what ideally they do. So these kind of things maybe that we would implement in order to prevent or maybe reduce the effects in the environment which affects the people in the community.
Right. So you're talking about better control, regulation, and oversight. Important points there. Rahul, I'd like to bring you in to a comment that Mr. Sablok made, and which was very pertinent, which was the fact that ESG and compliance around it was taken as something the EHS department does. And,
Right.
we've also seen in healthcare, quality is the chief quality officer's job, or it is a department's job. Whereas we know that quality, patient delivery of quality outcomes is actually across the board, whether it is
Absolutely.
the housekeeper right up to the senior consultant. And similarly for ESG, do you think we need similar governance structures to be in place in hospitals which go across functions for us to make a meaningful change? Your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think it's very important if you look at what we are doing as an organization or as an industry. It's where we look at ESG is also a topic which also has to come from the leadership, right? Whether it has to be integrated across the system, the question is, and the answer is yes, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. But as we all know that whether it is ESG in the form of, whether it is CSR, whether it is our framework that we want to develop, at the end of the day, whether it is environmental or social, or to actually have a framework for governance, it is the intent which has to be very, very clear on what we want to do. If we are looking at our, developing our 3 Ps and not looking at only 1 P of profit, but also looking at our planet, also looking at, the overall people, then probably we'll be investing in the right manner. Similarly here, there are a few things within ESG which I think probably it's important to discuss, is which does not cost money. The social angle, if you look at that, how transparent we are within our own system, how we are developing our efforts to make sure that we give respect to our employees. We'll focus a lot more on human rights. We focus a lot more than just 2% of the CSR. So that is one part definitely consciously we can take a call and work upon. While the environmental part is a lot to do with, I would say, is what we do as a framework, which is a lot more to do with regulation, is what we can control. Governance is something very, very critical internally as well as externally, because like you said, whether it is MCA, whether it is SEBI, those regulations, those BRSR reports, everything is there to control us. Internally, how well do we monitor ourselves? How well we are able to, make sure that if it is a relation with the vendor, are we looking at a vendor relation, or are we looking at a commercial transaction? Are we integrating them as a part of our stakeholder and looking at also their practices, also looking at their outcome, and overall making it a part of contributing together in a society? So these all angle I think is very, very critical. And here, all of these practices actually is possible to integrate at each level, whether it is at board level, whether it is at senior leadership team level, or whether it is to do with not just EHS or a licensing department, but also within our system, that people must know that in a hospital, if we are spending every day, let's say half a kg of waste per day per bed, what is our efforts to make it 0.4? What is our efforts to make it 0.3, regardless of there is a regulation or not? Can we do it better? What are we doing to change these plastic bottles into more environment-friendly bottles which we can use it? What are we doing to replace papers to probably tabs? So all these aspects internally, and as a part of our own internal practice, which is not possible only by one team or leadership or EHS, but rather to do with internally, including all teams, including even our security guards, right, who focuses on overall all these practices, is very, very critical, I believe.
Yeah, very good points there. Dr. Chaturvedi, I'd like to bring you in. Rahul spoke about that very important fact that many things are easy to do, low-hanging fruits. We can do them without any additional cost. It's just about some consciousnness, intent, and execution. But there is a cost.
Yes.
ESG is not going to be cheap. I think nothing comes cheap. Unless you just open an Excel sheet and just a check mark approach and try to get away with it, but we know that that's not going to be possible. Could you talk to us about what sort of resources would actually need to go in? And for a company like Aurobindo, I mean, you have a geographic spread pretty much across the world.
Yes.
It would need a lot of resources, whether it's financial, manpower, managerial, technology. Could you throw some light on that?
Yeah. So I think I want to come back to a point that Rahul alluded to, that the intent is the starting point. Okay. And it all stems from the intent of the investors who want to make a profit without compromising on the environment, society, or governance. So coming back to in terms of what kind of resources are required for this, clearly, the larger the organization, larger the budget required for managing something like this. But the good thing is, even though we have a geographic spread, once you get the system in place, it's a very modular approach. And in terms of benchmarking, which is the first pass of arriving to where you are currently, what's your current status, that is something where you can actually do this exercise on Teams, Zoom calls, or whatever. You don't physically need to travel to all different parts of the world. Where the real investment is required is perhaps a lot on the E side. On the society side, it all depends on company to company. And let me give a specific example. Today, it is mandatory for all companies with X number of employees to have medical coverage for their employees. Now, there is no government mandate that says whether that upper ceiling on the medical insurance should be 1 lakh or 10 lakhs. But the premium is clearly going to change. So taking care of your employees as part of S is there. I'm not counting taking care of society as part of CSR. That's a different spend altogether.
And that's also a cost, as you're
That's
saying.
also
That's
a cost. But the good thing is, you don't mind spending that money because you are making enough profit to be able to do it. In fact, it's a matter of great delight, if your CSR spend is high, because it naturally means that your overall profits are also very high. So the largest capex or investment required in ESG is really on the E side, particularly for a manufacturing company like us that creates solvents, handles a lot of chemicals. Some are hazardous, some are not so hazardous. But the ability to recycle them, the ability to repurpose them, the ability to, sometimes destroy them, all of that costs, we incur a cost on that.
That's important. So there are opportunities, but there are costs. There are constraints, but then there are resources internally available. There are quick to do things, and then there are strategic things that you can sort of use within the existing frameworks that you have to become more and more compliant, and it's a journey. Mr. Sablok, I'd like to bring you into this. So does that mean that ESG will actually increase your operating costs and impinge on your profits? And if so, what can companies do to make sure that they become compliant, become good corporate citizens, be ESG compliant also, but take care of that cost, because the CFO will be watching the bottom line?
Yeah, see, basically ESG in the beginning will of course involve a huge cost. But if we see a long-term purpose of this, over a period of 5 years, 10 years, it becomes a very, very incremental cost. And you also start yielding benefits, because if you are very environment friendly, your process also, your team also will become aligned to that. And they will see how to use a better quality product, how to see that they do not waste a lot of reagents or consumables. Today what happens, if by efficiency into the system, you can reduce your wastage. Second, on the social front, it has a major role to play, because today if you are having a right diversity, right pay scale, right minority into the organization, the message which you give to the society, you can be a real good for any organization or for any campus. Today you become a brand ambassador. People would like to be associated with you if you are following the social. And in terms of governance, definitely governance has to be there, because unless you don't have governance, I don't think governance involves a lot of cost. It is only being transparent into the system, and which is very, very important for your customers, for your internal employees. So it is definitely going to help in the long run.
Right. Dr. Chaturvedi, what are the reputational risks or inherent risks of not just being ESG compliant, but not being more mindful of these aspects of ESG, which is the new paradigm now?
Understand. So before I answer that question, I just have a comment on the previous discussion topic. The right way to think about the cost is, it's not a cost, it's an investment. It's the cost of doing business. So if I'm not compliant to a bare minimum standard on the ESG guidelines, I may actually not be eligible to participate in some European tenders. So it's not just doing the right thing, it's a true business imperative. Now let me come about the second question that you asked me about the reputational risk of not being in compliance. I think clearly, the larger the size of the organization, the more you stand to lose. So, and not just financially, a hit here may impact your ability to recruit, new candidates, particularly when you're recruiting at a management trainee or, engineering trainee level, because today's young generation is extremely mindful of all this. Before they go for interviews, they research not only the balance sheet and the P&L statements of the company, but they also look at, sustainability reports, any ESG guidelines that you've published, and what is it that you've committed to doing. So I think it's a risk of not doing it, and that cost could be very high.
Right. So important point there, that there are costs, there are opportunities, but then there are downsides, both in terms of you being exposed to risks, both within the business that you're not watching over, which can be covered under the ESG framework, and not being able to attract talent or being a workplace of an aspirational value in the future. We're just drawing this conversation to a close. We have just about 5 minutes left. If you do have any questions, please hold on to them. I just wanted to park that thought that we will be taking a few questions now. But before we do that, I'd just like to bring in Rahul onto this. So you heard that there is a downside also. And I'll come to you also about this, Dr. Srikanth. If we don't do this, right, we can't hide behind the fact that we treat patients and therefore we are good corporate citizens. If we don't do this, there are reputational risks. And healthcare providers have been at the short end, the receiving end of that over years now. How do you see this as a reputational risk by not communicating your sustainability goals, intentions, or purpose?
Because this question is there, Karan, in the first place, I think the stakes are high for us already, right, if not more. And that's why it's already very, very important if you look at, since the time we have seen the last 3-4 years from COVID time, that it is not just about the quantity of work that we do. It's also the quality of work we do. It's also, as an industry, as a healthcare service delivery industry, what reputation do all of us carry together? So clearly the answer is that it is always a risk. And for us, while we are doing it from S and G perspective, especially S perspective, it is easier because there is a lot of responsibilities already as inherent part of our goals. But from E perspective also, it is very, very important that we focus on them. As I said earlier, from all the 3 P's perspective, but from a long-term perspective, that we are looking at all our stakeholders as health equity. As we are able to make sure that they all contribute to the overall burden that we have. We are all talking about also the issue that we have of the loss that we have because of productivity, right? Now, these are things which is far-fetched, I understand, even from ESG point of view, but it's very, very important that we look at from a holistic point of view, own it, because it is very important. One simple example, if we look at, and that is something is very, very prevalent in our city as well. Whenever we look at a market, we see that in one place, whenever there is more similar businesses available, we do more, right? Similarly, if we all together represent the industry in the right manner, from an E, S, and G perspective, we are doing the right thing, being into the social sector as well. I think it is it's going to only yield better for all of us together. And as Mr. Sablok said in the beginning, in the earlier question rightly, that it is an investment in the beginning, but it is a long-term gain that we are going to have. It is also to do with our reputation, also to do with our brand image, the way we represent ourselves, and most importantly, also to do with our efforts for which we do not need to do marketing. If we establish our name in the proper fashion, probably the credibility, word of mouth is the best marketing in our industry. If we're able to do that, then that social credibility is actually seeded in.
Right. So social value, societal value, corporate value, everything gets developed on that. Dr. Srikanth, last word, and then we open up for a few questions.
Yeah, I see. So I see most of the hospitals have already started doing it, but they may not know they're heading it under the ESG. If you look at it in that way, so post-COVID, especially if you look at, so the electrical system, because the healthcare industry is one of the largest industry which consumes the high electricity and the other part of the commercial related thing. So we started implementing LED bulb system in the system, and we started doing HVAC system in the entire system. So uh, indirectly we started doing it, but we do not know that it is under the heading of ESG. Yes, it is going to give that. So every hospital has got STPs. They are actually making the effluent fluid treated and getting it released. So it is that formulate the guidelines in a way that every hospital practices at their own ability and the strength. And certainly, as Dr. Chaturvedi said, it is an investment, it's not an expenditure, because the one which you are investing today, eventually that going to give you results over a period of time. And as Rahul said, it builds the trust in the community. And yes, so we will say that in a broad moment that we are one of the largest contributor, as now Dr. Chaturvedi said, and representing the Aurobindo. So everyone will have that opportunity to represent in the market. And I see it as an investment going forward. We will have everyone has to participate in ESG and make these standards more practical, implementable, and benefit to the society.
Right. So common consensus on that. With that, I'll open to questions. Somebody can unburden me from asking all the questions. Somebody else can also please. Sir, right there, if you could identify yourself and direct the question to one of the panelists, or if it's a general question, we'd love to hear that. But I'd request that it be a question and not a comment, if you could just. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Dr. Anil here. One generic question. What you can't capture, you can't measure. What you can't measure, you can't improve. What you can't improve is not something which is sustainable, right? So my baseline question is, how are you all doing it, both in pharma and in healthcare hospitals? How are you actually capturing and baselining your ESG activities within your sector?
Dr. Chaturvedi.
Okay, I can talk about the pharma. Within pharma, our starting point has been the SDG goals. And those are very well defined. So for example, on renewable energy, there's a clear target that 20% of all the energy consumed within the organization should be from a renewable source. So we measured where we were at about 5% or so. Every year we've taken a target of improving it a few percentage points. We are currently just shy of 9%, I think. So if you look at there are 19 or 17 goals. 17 goals. Each of them is very measurable and very well defined. And what you have to do is you've got to measure your own baseline against each of these 17 goals and try to attain that.
Within hospitals, even if you just measure energy consumption, you measure water and waste, and look at intensity data, there's very simple software which is available, which can throw out the emissions from the electricity consumed. Your emissions inventory is available, water and waste that you're generating and reusing. The simple standards, if you use to begin with and see trends over months and years, that is a starting point on the environmental aspect. On social and governance, as Dr. Chaturvedi said, the UN SDGs are very clearly demarcated on what your aspirations should be. There are goals and performance indicators within that, so they expand into about 180. You can pick a few from each of those and work towards it. It's not compulsory for any organization to work on all 17, but if you pick 4 or 5 aligned to your line of work, that's a starting point that you can measure year on year. There are some free tools available also for healthcare. The Aga Khan Development Network, AKDN, has worked on a tool with the WHO, which is available on the WHO website, which can give you your environmental consumption, which is a good starting point at least for an organization. Any other questions, sir? I think there's a question at the back. Could you have the mic to sir, please? Yeah.
Hello, I'm B.R. Suri from the Petro Group, just an independent director. But what I'm asking you all may be common to other industries also. Internally itself, you may be facing a lot of resistance from the top and the bottom. Bottom would not like status quo to be disturbed. Top, पैसे कितने कम खर्चे हुए उतना बेहतर है in any organization. Until and unless they get a penalty put on them or such type of experience, convincing becomes a Herculean task. How are you tackling this? Like Bangalore, you have near that Forum Mall, a continuous stream of affluence. That's why I said it's common to all industry.
Yeah.
Is it that it is beyond solution?
Excellent question. Dr. Chaturvedi, you deal with boards, you deal with managers, you deal with people down the line, you deal with customers. Could you answer that for us?
I think, if I look at the carrot versus the stick, carrot usually works better. But more importantly, what works even better than either the carrot or the stick is once you tell them why this is the right thing to do, once any human being understands that what they are doing will not only help them, it will help the next generation as well. And at the same time, without having a negative impact to the business, you usually get buy-in. So I think rather than start at the bottom, ESG works better when it's a top-down driven approach. And, CXOs across organizations have to take it as part of their own KRA. Unless you do that, this is not going to really get rolled out within the organization. So you start at the top, and you start at the top by communicating the seriousness, commitment, and the importance of why this is relevant to the organization. And I think 80% of the job is done. The other 20% you can achieve through a mix of, carrot and stick.
Thank you. We're at the end of our time here. It's been a fascinating discussion. I didn't know in 45 minutes we could cover the entire range of subjects that we have covered, from risks to opportunities to what we can do to why we should do it, why we should not avoid it. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. Dr. Chaturvedi, Mr. Sablok, Mr. Datta, Dr. Srikanth, a big round of applause for all of them. Thank you for your insights. This has been really fruitful and a great learning experience for me. Thanks DNB for having this. We should actually mainstream both ESG and sustainability into such summits, because there's an exchange of ideas, and this is something which will become more important the years ahead. And thank you. And with that, I'll hand over to the organizers.
Thank you so much. Wasn't that one hell of a discussion? That was absolutely stunning. So I would just request you to be on stage for just 1 minute more, and I would request Dr. Arun Singh to hand over some mementos to our panelists and our moderator today. So first we have Dr. Sanjay Chaturvedi.
Excuse me, sir.
We have Mr. Rakesh Sablok. First, I'll cover all the panelists. Then we have Mr. Rahul Datta. Dr. Srikanth Vodnala. And finally, our brilliant moderator, Dr. Karan Thakur. Can we have a group picture with everyone?